Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What if the future has already happened? The morning of the time capsule unearthing was meant to be a celebration, not the beginning of my descent into madness. As faculty advisor to Pinewood High's Historical Society, I'd been looking forward to this day for months. The capsule, buried 30 years ago in 1994, was finally going to reveal its secrets. I arrived early at the school grounds, the autumn fog still clinging to the West Virginia hills surrounding our small town of Millbrook. The mist seemed to dampen every sound, creating an unnatural silence that made the crunch of my footsteps on the gravel path seem impossibly loud. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Something about the day felt off, a subtle wrongness I couldn't quite place. Principal Andrews met me at the ceremonial site, a small fenced-off area near the football field where a simple granite marker indicated the capsule's location. "Morning, Professor Reynolds," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Big day, huh?" I nodded, trying to shake off my unease. The kids are excited. Some of them have grandparents who contributed to the capsule. The grounds crew had already begun carefully removing the earth around the marker. A small crowd had gathered, students, faculty, and several older residents who'd been present for the original burial. I recognized Elaine Hodges, now in her 70s, who had been principal when the capsule was interred. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," she told me, her eyes distant with memory. "We were so optimistic about the future then." As the crew worked, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone were watching me. I turned, scanning the crowd, but saw only excited faces. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the capsule, a cylindrical metal container about the size of a small fire extinguisher, finally emerged from the earth. The grounds crew handed it to me with ceremonial gravity. It was heavier than I expected, and oddly warm to the touch despite having been buried underground for decades. I attributed this to the friction of being dug up, but something about it felt wrong. "Would you like to do the honors, Professor Reynolds?" Principal Andrews asked, gesturing to the small stage that had been set up for the occasion. My hands trembled slightly as I carried the capsule to the podium. The crowd fell silent, all eyes focused on the relic from the past. I examined the container closely. It was sealed with a simple twist mechanism, surprisingly free of corrosion given its long burial. "Today, we bridged 3 decades of history," I began, addressing the gathered crowd. "Inside this capsule are the hopes, dreams, and memories of Pinewood High's class of 1994. As I spoke, my fingers worked the seal. It gave way with unexpected ease, as if it had been opened recently. The thought was absurd. The capsule had been buried continuously for 30 years, the ground above it undisturbed until today. I removed the lid, and immediately a musty, peculiar odor escaped, not the smell of decay I might have expected, but something else, something that reminded me of ozone and burnt electronics. Inside, I found a stack of papers, photographs, and small artifacts, all carefully preserved in plastic. I removed the first item, a yearbook from 1994, and held it up for the crowd to see. This was expected, documented in the inventory that had been kept of the capsule's contents. But as I continued extracting items, my confusion grew. Among the expected memorabilia, cassette tapes, a portable CD player, handwritten letters. I found things that shouldn't have been there. Couldn't have been there. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, bearing the date October 12, 2009. 15 years after the capsule had been sealed. My hands began to shake more violently now. I set the clipping aside, hoping no one had noticed, and continued. More artifacts emerged, a smartphone, a technology that didn't exist in 1994. A flash drive. A magazine with a cover story about President Obama's second term. And then, the photographs. They were Polaroids, the kind that developed instantly, a technology that did exist in 1994. But the subjects of the photos were impossible. Children I recognized from our current student body, except they appeared as adults in the images. Thomas Weaver, a sophomore in my AP history class, shown as a man in his 30s, standing beside a house that hadn't been built yet. Jessica Morton, our star volleyball player, pictured in a graduate's cap and gown from a university ceremony that wouldn't happen for years. My internal monologue became frantic. This isn't possible. Someone's playing an elaborate prank. These items couldn't have been in this capsule for 30 years. I glanced up at the crowd, wondering if I would see knowing smiles, someone ready to claim responsibility for the hoax. Instead, I saw only confused expressions as people began to murmur, noticing my distress. Professor Reynolds? Principal Andrews approached the podium. Is everything all right? I couldn't answer. My throat had constricted, my mind racing with impossible scenarios. I looked back down at the capsule and noticed something I had missed before, a folded piece of paper at the very bottom. I reached for it with trembling fingers and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, the ink still vibrant despite the years. The handwriting was familiar, disturbingly so. It was my own. Be careful what you unearth, it read. Some truths are buried for a reason. The date on the note was tomorrow's date. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, the sound distorting in my ears until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The familiar school grounds suddenly felt alien and threatening. The fog, which had been burning off with the morning sun, seemed to thicken again, swirling around the edges of the gathering. I looked up from the note to see Elaine Hodges staring at me with an expression of horror. "That's not our capsule," she whispered, but somehow I heard her clearly despite the distance between us. Ours was copper, not steel. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If this wasn't the capsule that had been buried 30 years ago, then what was it? And who had put it there? As if in answer to my unspoken question, my phone buzzed in my pocket. With numb fingers, I retrieved it and looked at the screen. A text message from an unknown number. "Now you know. They're coming. Run." The sky darkened overhead, clouds gathering with unnatural speed. In the distance, I heard a sound like thunder, but it didn't fade, it grew louder, more persistent. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. And in that moment, I knew with terrible certainty that opening the capsule had set something in motion, something that couldn't be stopped. I don't remember leaving the ceremony. One moment I was standing at the podium, paralyzed by the impossible contents of the capsule. The next, I was in my classroom, door locked, blinds drawn, spreading the items across my desk with shaking hands. The thunder-like rumbling had subsided, but the sky remained an unnatural shade of gray-green, casting sickly light through the slats in the blinds. Outside, I could hear confused voices, the ceremony apparently disbanded in chaos when I'd fled. "Think, Reynolds, think. There has to be a logical explanation." but logic had abandoned me the moment I'd opened that capsule. I examined each item again, methodically, as if scientific scrutiny might dissolve the impossibility of their existence. The newspaper clipping from 2009 detailed a mining disaster in our county, one I remembered well. 37 men trapped underground for 16 days. All survived, a miracle that had brought national attention to our little town. The smartphone was a model released in 2018, according to the information printed on its back. It was dead, of course, the battery long expired. The flash drive was unmarked, useless without a computer to read it. But the photographs, they were the most disturbing artifacts. I recognized every student pictured, all current attendees of Pinewood High. Yet here they were, shown as adults in scenes that hadn't happened yet. Thomas Weaver standing proudly before a colonial-style house on Oak Ridge Drive, a vacant lot in the present day. Jessica Morton in her graduation gown, holding a diploma from Princeton. My hands trembled as I picked up a photo of Daniel Porter, a quiet junior who rarely spoke in class. In the image, he wore a military uniform, his face gaunt and haunted, standing amid ruins I didn't recognize. The background looked like a war zone. A knock at the door made me jump, scattering the photos. Professor Reynolds? It was Principal Andrews. Are you all right? Everyone's concerned. I gathered the items quickly, stuffing them back into the capsule. I'm fine, I called out, my voice betraying me with a slight tremor. Just feeling a bit unwell. Must be the excitement. Do you need medical attention? What happened with the capsule? Nothing, I lied. Just some old memorabilia. I'll bring it to your office later for proper display. There was a pause. If you're sure. He sounded doubtful. The superintendent wants to speak with you when you're feeling better. This was supposed to be a media event. Tomorrow, I promised. I'll explain everything tomorrow. His footsteps retreated down the hallway. I exhaled slowly, my mind racing. My note, had been dated tomorrow. What was going to happen in the next 24 hours that would compel me to write such a warning? I needed to understand what I was dealing with. If someone had replaced the original capsule with this one, they must have had a reason. The text message on my phone suggested I was in danger, but from whom? And why? I retrieved my phone and stared at the message again. Now you know. They're coming. Run. As if triggered by my reading it, the message began to delete itself, the characters disappearing one by one until the screen was blank. A chill ran down my spine. That wasn't possible with standard messaging technology. The room temperature seemed to drop suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me, though the heating system hummed steadily. In the corner of the room, shadows deepened, coalesced, moved in ways that shadows shouldn't. It's stress, I told myself. You're having a psychological reaction to something you can't explain. But rationality was a thin shield against the growing sense that something fundamental had changed when I opened that capsule, as if I'd torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself. I decided to focus on the most tangible lead, the photographs. If these were current students depicted as adults, perhaps the answers lay with them. I selected 3 images: Thomas Weaver with his future house, Jessica Morton at her graduation, and Daniel Porter in his military uniform. Checking the time, 10:45, students would be in third period. I unlocked my door and stepped into the hallway. It was deserted, unnaturally quiet. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to move independently of any objects. I made my way to the main office, where I could check the class schedules. The secretary, Mrs. Belmont, looked up as I entered, her eyes widening slightly. "Professor Reynolds, are you feeling better? Everyone's been talking about what happened at the ceremony." "Much better," I lied again. "Just a bit of vertigo." "Could you tell me where I might find Thomas Weaver, Jessica Morton, and Daniel Porter right now?" She frowned, typing at her computer. "Thomas and Jessica are both in Mr. Hoffman's physics class. Daniel..." She paused, her frown deepening. "That's odd." "What is it?" "Daniel Porter was marked absent today. His mother called this morning to report him missing. Apparently, he didn't come home last night." The words hit me like a physical blow. Daniel Porter, missing. And in the photograph, he'd been wearing a military uniform, looking traumatized. A coincidence? I couldn't believe that anymore. "Thank you," I managed, turning to leave. "Professor?" Mrs. Belmont called after me. "There's something else. A man was looking for you earlier. Said he was from the Department of Education, but he didn't leave a card. He seemed intense." My pulse quickened. "What did he look like?" "Tall, thin, wearing a gray suit. He had these strange eyes, almost colorless." I nodded, trying to appear casual though my heart was racing. "If he comes back, let me know." The hallways seemed to stretch and distort as I made my way to the physics lab. The few students I passed gave me odd looks, quickly averting their eyes. Did I look as frightened as I felt? Or was there something else, something they could sense about me? "You're being paranoid," I chided myself. "Focus on the facts." But what were the facts? A capsule filled with impossible items. A missing student. A mysterious man looking for me. A warning for myself, dated tomorrow. Outside the physics lab, I paused, gathering my composure. Through the small window in the door, I could see Mr. Hoffman at the whiteboard, explaining what looked like a complex equation. Thomas and Jessica sat in the front row, both taking notes. I knocked softly, then entered without waiting for a response. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. "Excuse me, Mr. Hoffman," I said, striving for a normal tone. "I need to speak with Thomas and Jessica for a moment. School newspaper wants a follow-up on the time capsule ceremony." Mr. Hoffman nodded, though he looked puzzled. "Of course. Thomas, Jessica, you're excused." The two students exchanged glances before gathering their things and following me into the hallway. Once the door closed behind us, I led them to a quiet alcove near the water fountains. "Professor Reynolds," Jessica began, "are you okay? You looked terrified at the ceremony." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Everyone's saying you found something weird in the capsule." I studied their faces carefully. They appeared genuinely concerned, confused, not like people involved in an elaborate hoax. I decided to take a risk. "What I'm about to show you needs to stay between us," I said, reaching into my bag. "I found these in the capsule today." I handed them each their respective photographs. Their reactions were immediate and visceral. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas's face drained of color. This is me," Jessica whispered. "But I've never applied to Princeton. I can't afford it." Thomas's hands were shaking. "This house. I've drawn this house since I was a kid. It's exactly how I always imagined it would look." but I've never shown anyone these drawings. Their reactions confirmed what I'd feared. These weren't just random images created to frighten me. They depicted actual futures that these students somehow recognized. There's more, I said, lowering my voice. Daniel Porter is missing. And I found this. I showed them the photograph of Daniel in uniform. Jessica's eyes widened further. That's impossible. Daniel's been talking about joining the army after graduation, but he hasn't enlisted yet. A distant rumble of thunder made us all look up, but there were no windows in the hallway. The fluorescent light above us flickered, then went out completely, plunging our alcove into shadow. What's happening? Thomas whispered. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. They've found you. Take the students and go to the football field. Now. As if on cue, the school's PA system crackled to life. Principal Andrews' voice came through, sounding strained, unnatural. Attention all faculty and students. This is not a drill. We are implementing immediate lockdown procedures. All personnel are to remain in classrooms with doors locked until further notice. We have unauthorized individuals on campus. The hallway emergency lights activated, casting everything in a red glow. In the distance, I heard doors slamming, the sudden shuffle of movement. Professor? Jessica's voice trembled. What do we do? I looked at the two terrified students, then at my phone, then back at them. Every instinct told me to follow protocol, to get to a classroom and lock the door. But the warning was clear, and somehow, I knew that staying put would be disastrous. We need to leave, I said, making a decision that went against everything I'd been trained to do. Now, through the gym exit, to the football field. Their eyes widened in disbelief, but something in my expression must have convinced them of the urgency. They nodded, and we began moving quickly down the hallway toward the gymnasium. The school had transformed into an alien landscape. Emergency lights bathed everything in crimson, shadows stretching and contracting with each flicker. The usual sounds of a busy high school, voices, locker doors, footsteps, had been replaced by an eerie silence punctuated only by distant announcements and the occasional slam of a door. As we rounded the corner toward the gym, I heard footsteps, measured, deliberate, coming from the administrative wing. Something about their rhythm was wrong, too precise, too mechanical. In here, I whispered, pulling Thomas and Jessica into a janitor's closet. We squeezed between mops and cleaning supplies, the door closing just as the footsteps reached our hallway. Through the thin crack between door and frame, I glimpsed a tall figure in a gray suit walking past, the man Mrs. Belmont had described. But there was something profoundly wrong about his movements. His limbs moved with unnatural fluidity, as if his joints weren't quite where they should be. As he passed directly in front of our hiding place, he paused. I held my breath. Beside me, I felt Jessica and Thomas tense. The man's head rotated, not turned, but rotated a full 90 degrees, facing our door. His eyes, as Mrs. Belmont had said, were almost colorless, like clouded glass. For a terrifying moment, I was certain he'd seen us. Then, abruptly, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. What the hell was that? Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know, I admitted. But we need to keep moving. We slipped out of the closet and hurried toward the gym, moving as quietly as possible. The gymnasium was dark, the high windows providing only minimal light through the continuing storm outside. We crossed the polished floor, our footsteps echoing despite our attempts at silence. The exit door was on the far side, leading directly to the athletic fields. As we approached it, my phone buzzed again. They're using the cameras. Stay out of sight. I looked up, suddenly aware of the security cameras mounted in the corners of the gym. One was rotating slowly, its red recording light blinking in the darkness. Keep to the walls, I instructed. Stay in the shadows. We edged along the perimeter of the gym, keeping our backs to the wall. The camera continued its mechanical sweep, but seemed to pause longer than it should have when pointing in our general direction. At last, we reached the exit. I pushed the bar, and the door swung open, triggering an alarm that blared through the building. There was no time for stealth now. Run! I shouted, and we burst out into the storm. The football field lay 100 yards ahead, across an expanse of open ground. The rain was coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning illuminated the scene in strobing flashes. We sprinted across the muddy ground, slipping and sliding. Behind us, I heard the gym door slam open again. I didn't look back. The football field was a rectangle of vibrant green amid the gray downpour. As we approached, I saw something that made no sense, a shimmering distortion in the air at the center of the field, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but stronger, more defined. What is that? Jessica gasped, slowing her pace. I don't know, I said, but that's where we need to go. We reached the edge of the field as another lightning flash illuminated the school behind us. In that instant, I saw them, 3 figures in gray suits, moving with that same wrong fluidity, emerging from the gym door. They're coming, Thomas said, his voice tight with fear. We ran onto the field, heading for the shimmering distortion. As we drew closer, I could see that it was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, the air within it rippling and bending like the surface of water. My phone buzzed one final time. Jump through. All of you. It's the only way. I looked at Thomas and Jessica, their faces pale with fear and confusion, rain streaming down their cheeks. I think we need to go through that, whatever it is, I said, pointing to the distortion. Are you insane? Thomas shouted over the storm. We don't know what it is. We don't have a choice. I gestured behind us, where the figures were closing in, moving with impossible speed despite the muddy terrain. Jessica grabbed Thomas's hand. I trust Professor Reynolds, she said, her voice steady despite everything. If he says we go through, we go through. I felt a surge of gratitude for our faith I wasn't sure I deserved. The 3 of us stood at the edge of the distortion, the air around it crackling with energy. Through its rippling surface, I could see something. Another place. Not the football field, but somewhere else entirely. On 3, I said, gripping their shoulders. 1, 2. Before I could say 3, one of the pursuing figures let out a sound, not a shout, not a word, but a high-pitched electronic whine that cut through the storm like a physical force. The sound seemed to vibrate in my bones, sending waves of nausea through me. Now! I screamed, and we leaped forward together into the shimmering distortion. The world dissolved around us. I felt as if I were being pulled apart at the molecular level, my consciousness stretched thin across an impossible distance. Colors I had no names for flashed before my eyes. Sounds with no earthly source filled my ears. And then, silence. Darkness. The sensation of falling. I hit solid ground with bone-jarring force, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. Beside me, I heard Thomas and Jessica land with similar grunts of pain. Gasping for breath, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. We were no longer on the football field. We weren't even outside anymore. We were in what appeared to be a vast, dimly lit warehouse filled with rows upon rows of shelving units, each containing hundreds of small metal containers. Containers that looked exactly like the time capsule I'd unearthed that morning. "Where are we?" Jessica whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. I shook my head, unable to answer. My gaze was fixed on a figure standing at the end of the nearest row of shelves, a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a face that, despite the additional lines and years, I recognized instantly. It was my own face. The older version of myself smiled grimly. "Welcome to the repository," he said. "I've been waiting for you for a very long time." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas and Jessica stared at the older version of me, then at me, their expressions cycling through confusion, disbelief, and fear. "This is impossible," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding strange in the vast space. My older self gave a bitter laugh. "That's exactly what I said 30 years ago, while I was standing where you are now." He gestured around the warehouse. "And yet, here we are." I struggled to my feet, helping Thomas and Jessica up as well. Now that my eyes had adjusted to the dim lighting, I could see the warehouse more clearly. It stretched in all directions, seemingly endless. Each metal container on the shelves was identical to the time capsule I'd unearthed that morning, except for small digital displays on their ends. "What is this place?" Jessica asked, her voice steadier than I would have expected given the circumstances. "The repository," my older self replied, stepping closer. "The central archive of the Temporal Adjustment Bureau. Or what's left of it." He looked haggard, I noticed. Thin and worn, with dark circles under his eyes and a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a scar I didn't have. "I don't understand," Thomas said. "What's happening? Who are those things chasing us?" "Enforcers," the older me said grimly. "Not quite human anymore. More like programmable matter with a directive. They work for the Bureau." "And what exactly is this Bureau?" I asked, still struggling to accept that I was talking to an older version of myself. My older self sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "It's complicated. The short version is that they're an organization that discovered how to manipulate time, not travel through it, exactly, but influence it. Send information backwards and forwards along the timeline." He gestured to the containers surrounding us. "These are their tools. Time capsules, they call them, though they're nothing like the harmless school mementos they're disguised as. Each one contains information from multiple possible futures, strategically placed to guide the timeline in specific directions." "But why?" Jessica asked. "What's the point?" "Control," my older self said simply. "If you can influence the past with knowledge of the future, you can shape reality itself. The Bureau has been doing it for decades, making small adjustments here and there to create the world they want." "And what world is that?" I asked. My older self's expression darkened. "One where they're in charge. Where humanity follows a path they've predetermined. They started small, influencing elections, steering technological development, preventing certain discoveries. But it escalated. The changes became bigger, more drastic." He turned to Daniel. In the original timeline, you never joined the military. You became a doctor, saved countless lives. But the Bureau needed a war to consolidate power, so they placed a capsule that would ensure you and thousands like you would enlist. Thomas looked shaken. And me? The house in the photo? In the original timeline, you became an architect, designed sustainable housing for low-income communities. The Bureau wanted those communities raised for development, so they planted seeds to divert your career path. And me? Jessica asked quietly. My older self's expression softened. You were meant to go to Princeton to discover something that would change the world. The Bureau made sure financial barriers would prevent that. I felt sick. So the capsule I found this morning was one I planted, my older self confirmed. A last-ditch effort to change things. I've been working against the Bureau for years, trying to correct the timeline, to put things back the way they were meant to be. But how did you get here? I asked. How did we get here? The distortion on the football field was a temporal gateway, a tear in the fabric of reality. They're rare, unpredictable, but I've learned to track them. I knew one would form today, and I knew the Bureau would detect your interference with the capsule. I needed to get you out before they processed you. The way he said process sent a chill down my spine. So what happens now? Thomas asked, his voice small in the vast space. My older self moved to a nearby console, typing rapidly. Screens flickered to life, displaying what looked like a map of glowing lines, intersecting and diverging in complex patterns. Now, he said, we fix what the Bureau broke. We restore the original timeline, or as close to it as we can get. How? Jessica asked. By sending you back with the right information. The capsule you found was just the beginning. It was meant to show you the truth, to prepare you for what comes next. He turned to face us fully, his expression grave. The Bureau has been placing these capsules at key points throughout history. Each one contains information designed to nudge events in their preferred direction. But if we can replace their capsules with our own, containing the truth about what's supposed to happen, we can restore the original timeline, I finished, beginning to understand. Exactly. But it won't be easy. The Bureau has enforcers throughout the timeline, guarding their capsules. And they'll be hunting for us, for you, now that you know the truth. A distant alarm began to sound, echoing through the warehouse. My older self's head snapped up, his expression tightening. They've found us. Sooner than I expected. He moved quickly to a shelf, retrieving 3 small metallic devices that looked like wristwatches. Put these on. They're temporal anchors. They'll keep you tethered to your original timeline when you jump. Jump? Thomas asked, his voice cracking. Through time, my older self confirmed, handing us each a device. I'm sending you back to key moments where you can make a difference. You'll need to find the Bureau's capsules and replace them with these. He retrieved 3 containers identical to the one I'd unearthed that morning. This is insane, I said, even as I strapped the device to my wrist. We can't just jump through time. You already did, my older self reminded me. How do you think you got here? The repository exists outside normal time. It's a nexus point connecting to all timelines. The alarm grew louder. In the distance, I heard the sound of doors being forced open, followed by that same electronic whine the enforcers had made at the school. We're out of time, my older self said grimly. He handed each of us one of the capsules. These contain the true information, what was supposed to happen before the Bureau interfered. Jessica, Yours needs to be placed at Princeton in the foundation of the Neuroscience Building, 2010. Thomas, yours goes to the Millbrook Community Planning Office, 2014. And you, he said, looking at me, yours goes back to Pinewood High, 1994. Replace the original capsule before it's buried. But how do we get to these places? Jessica asked, clutching her capsule. My older self moved to another console, typing rapidly. A series of doorways at the far end of the warehouse began to glow with the same shimmering distortion we'd seen on the football field. Temporal gateways, he explained, each calibrated to a specific time and place. Once you're through, you'll have 24 hours before the anchor brings you back to your original timeline. The sound of the enforcers grew closer. My older self's expression turned urgent. Listen carefully, this is critical. The Bureau doesn't just manipulate time, they manipulate memory. When you return to your timeline, you'll start to forget what happened here. The anchors will slow the process, but eventually, the Bureau's influence will reassert itself. He pressed something into my hand, a small metal cylinder with a button on one end. When that happens, use this. It contains a concentrated memory trigger, images, sounds, sensations that will bring everything back. But use it sparingly. Each time you activate it, the Bureau will be able to track you. The first of the enforcers appeared at the far end of the warehouse, gray-suited figures moving with that same long fluidity. My older self pushed us toward the glowing doorways. Go! Now! And remember, trust no one who doesn't recognize the capsule for what it is. Jessica was the first to move, rushing toward the leftmost gateway. She paused at the threshold, looking back at us with determination in her eyes. I'll see you soon, she said, and stepped through, vanishing in a flash of light. Thomas hesitated, then squared his shoulders and ran for the center gateway. Good luck, he called back, before disappearing as well. I stood alone with my older self, the approaching enforcers now less than 100 yards away. What happens to you? I asked. He smiled sadly. I've already lived my life, made my choices, some good, some bad. This is your chance to make better ones. He pushed me toward the remaining gateway. Go. And remember the note in the capsule. Be careful what you unearth. Some truths are buried for a reason. I ran for the gateway, the capsule clutched tightly in my arms. As I reached the threshold, I looked back one last time. My older self stood facing the approaching enforcers, a small device in his hand. Our eyes met across the distance, and he nodded once. I stepped through the gateway. The world dissolved again, that same sensation of being pulled apart and reassembled. Colors, sounds, sensations beyond description. And then I was falling through darkness, through time itself. I landed hard on familiar ground, the football field at Pinewood High. But not my Pinewood High. The buildings in the distance were older, the trees smaller. A banner hung across the main entrance, Welcome Class of 1994. I had made it back. 30 years in the past, before the capsule was buried, before the Bureau's interference. I had 24 hours to find the original capsule and replace it with my own. 24 hours to change the future. I checked the temporal anchor on my wrist. The display showed a countdown, 23 hours, 58 minutes, and 47 seconds. No time to waste. As I made my way across the empty field toward the school, I felt a strange doubling of my consciousness, memories of a future that hadn't happened yet layered over this unfamiliar past. The temporal anchor on my wrist felt heavy, a constant reminder of my impossible mission. The school looked both familiar and foreign. The architecture was the same, but missing with the modern additions I'd grown accustomed to: the East Wing expansion, the renovated gymnasium, the digital marquee. Instead, there were construction materials piled near the main entrance, preparations for a ceremony that would happen tomorrow, the time capsule burial. I needed to find somewhere to hide, to plan my next move. According to my older self, I had to locate the Bureau's capsule before it was buried and replace it with the one I carried. But I couldn't simply walk into the school, not looking as I did, a stranger from the future. I circled around to the back of the building, finding a maintenance shed that stood unlocked. Inside, among lawn equipment and cleaning supplies, I discovered a janitor's uniform. It wasn't ideal, but it would help me blend in better than my modern clothes. After changing, I slipped into the school through a side entrance. The hallways were mostly empty. It was summer break, with only staff present for preparations. Posters for bands I'd forgotten existed adorned the walls. A bulletin board announced a fall lineup of TV shows, names that existed now only in streaming service archives. I needed to find the original capsule. The ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow, which meant the capsule was likely being prepared today. I made my way toward the administrative offices, pushing a borrowed mop bucket to complete my disguise. As I rounded a corner, I nearly collided with a younger version of Elaine Hodges, the woman who had attended our ceremony 30 years in the future. Here, she was in her 40s, vibrant and commanding as the school principal. "Excuse me," she said, looking at me with slight confusion. "Are you new? I don't recall seeing you on the maintenance staff before." I swallowed hard, forcing a casual smile. "Just started this week, ma'am. Summer replacement." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my explanation. "Well, we're quite busy today preparing for tomorrow's ceremony. The time capsule needs to be moved from my office to the auditorium for the final additions before tomorrow's burial." My pulse quickened. "The time capsule? Is that the copper one I saw someone working on earlier?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, that's right. A lovely copper cylinder. The Historical Society had it specially made." She paused, studying me. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said, trying to sound casual. "Never seen a time capsule ceremony before." Principal Hodges smiled. "It's quite an event. We're burying it with contributions from this year's graduating class, memories to be unearthed 30 years from now." She checked her watch. "I should get going. The capsule is in my office if you need to clean in there. Just be careful around it, it's very special." As she walked away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The capsule was in her office, unguarded, waiting to be replaced. It seemed too easy. But of course, it wasn't. As I approached the administrative wing, I noticed a man in a gray suit standing outside the principal's office. Even from a distance, something about his posture seemed wrong, too rigid, too perfect. An enforcer, here in 1994, guarding the Bureau's capsule. I retreated around the corner, mind racing. I couldn't approach directly. The enforcer would recognize me, or at least sense that I didn't belong to this time. I needed a distraction. The fire alarm was the obvious solution, but too disruptive. It would bring too many people to the area. I needed something more targeted. In a supply closet, I found what I was looking for, the electrical panel for this section of the building. With a silent apology to the administrative staff, I flipped the breakers for the office wing. Immediately, the hallway went dark. I heard confused voices from the direction of the offices and footsteps heading away, likely staff going to investigate the outage. I waited, counting slowly to 30, then peered around the corner. The enforcer was still there, unmoved by the darkness. But now Principal Hodges emerged from her office, flashlight in hand. "Sir," she addressed the enforcer, "we need to check the electrical panel. Would you mind assisting? It's quite dark back there." The enforcer hesitated, its programming seemingly conflicted between guarding the capsule and maintaining its human cover. Finally, it nodded stiffly. "Of course, Principal Hodges." As they walked away, I seized my chance, slipping into the principal's office. In the dim emergency lighting, I spotted the copper cylinder on her desk, just as she had described, nothing like the steel container I'd unearthed in my time. With trembling hands, I examined it. The seal was simple, designed to be opened easily for tomorrow's ceremony. I twisted it open, peering inside. The contents were similar to what a time capsule should contain: photographs, letters, small mementos from 1994. But mixed among them were subtle anachronisms, tiny technological components that didn't belong in this era, seemingly innocent documents containing information that would influence future decisions. Working quickly, I transferred all the genuine items, the true memories of the class of 1994, into the capsule I brought from the repository. Then I sealed both containers and switched them, placing the Bureau's capsule into my bag and leaving my replacement on the desk. Just as I finished, I heard voices approaching. Frantically, I looked for somewhere to hide. The office had no closet, no convenient furniture to duck behind. The only option was beneath the desk itself, a tight fit, but my only chance. I squeezed into the knee space, pulling the chair in as much as possible to conceal me. Seconds later, the door opened. "The power should be back momentarily," Principal Hodges was saying. "Maintenance is checking the breakers now." "I see." The enforcer's voice was flat and motionless. "The capsule appears undisturbed." "Of course it is," Hodges replied, sounding puzzled by his concern. "It's just a time capsule. Who would bother with it?" There was a pause, and I held my breath, certain the enforcer would sense my presence, would detect the substitution I'd made. "Indeed," it finally said. "Nevertheless, I will remain until the ceremony is complete. For security purposes." "As you wish," Hodges said, clearly confused by the stranger's interest but too polite to question it further. "Though I still don't understand why the Department of Education is so concerned with our little ceremony." They left the office, and I exhaled slowly. I'd done it, replaced the capsule. But I was far from safe. The enforcer remained, and I was trapped in this office with no clear way out. I checked the temporal anchor, 22 hours 14 minutes and 53 seconds remaining. Almost 2 hours gone already. I had to escape, to find somewhere to hide until the anchor pulled me back to my timeline. The lights flickered back on. I heard movement in the outer office, the secretary returning to her desk. I was trapped, with no way out except through the main door. Then I noticed the window. Principal Hodges' office was on the ground floor, overlooking a small courtyard. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. Carefully, I emerged from under the desk and approached the window. It was open a few inches for ventilation, enough that I could open it further without making noise. I slid it up slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. Once it was open, I eased myself through, dropping quietly into the bushes below. I stayed low, crawling until I reached the edge of the courtyard, then sprinted for the cover of the maintenance shed where I'd found the uniform. Inside, I changed back into my own clothes. The Bureau's capsule was secure in my bag, the replacement in place. Mission accomplished, at least the first part. Now I just had to survive until the anchor pulled me back. But where could I go? I couldn't risk being seen in town, not while I might encounter people who would later know me. And I certainly couldn't return to the school with the enforcer present. As I pondered my options, a sound outside the shed froze me in place, footsteps approaching slowly. Not the mechanical precision of an enforcer, but cautious, deliberate steps. The door creaked open. I pressed myself against the wall, ready to fight or flee. But the figure that entered wasn't an enforcer. It was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with auburn hair and intense green eyes that widened when she saw me. "Professor Reynolds," she whispered. I stared at her in confusion. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You don't recognize me yet, but you will." She extended her hand, revealing a temporal anchor identical to mine strapped to her wrist. "I'm Jessica Morton. From about 50 years from now." My mind reeled as I stared at the woman before me. She couldn't be Jessica, the teenage girl I'd left behind just hours ago, the student I'd sent through a temporal gateway to 2010. And yet, there was something in her eyes, a familiar determination I recognized. "That's not possible," I said. "Jessica should be at Princeton in 2010. The woman, Jessica, nodded sadly. I was. I completed my mission there. But then things got complicated. She glanced at her temporal anchor. "We don't have much time. The enforcers are sweeping the grounds. We need to move. How are you here? Your anchor should have pulled you back to our timeline." "It's a long story," she said, peering cautiously out the shed door. "The short version is that I've been jumping through time for decades now, trying to fix what went wrong. This isn't my first visit to 1994. She looked back at me, her expression grim. "It's not even my first time meeting you here." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're caught in a loop, Professor. Every time we think we've fixed the timeline, the Bureau adapts. They plant new capsules, create new divergences." She sighed heavily. "We've done this dance many times now. So we fail? Every time? Not exactly. Each cycle, we learn more, change more." Her eyes locked with mine, fierce with determination. "And this time, I think we might finally break the pattern." Before I could respond, Jessica tensed, her gaze shifting to something outside. "They're coming. We need to go." She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back of the shed. "Go where?" I asked, but she was already pushing aside a stack of garden tools, revealing a small trapdoor in the floor that I hadn't noticed. "The old tunnel system," she explained, lifting the door. "Built during the Cold War. Most people forgot they existed, but the Bureau uses them to move through key locations without being noticed." She gestured for me to descend. "Hurry." I climbed down a rusted ladder into darkness. Jessica followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above us. A moment later, a flashlight illuminated our surroundings, a narrow concrete tunnel stretching in both directions. "This way," Jessica said, heading left. "There's a safe house about half a mile from here." As we walked, questions burned in my mind. If we're caught in a loop, doomed to repeat this cycle, what's the point? Why keep trying? Jessica's pace didn't slow, because each iteration changes something. Small adjustments compound over time. The Bureau is powerful, but not omnipotent. They can't control everything. But they control enough, I said, thinking of the impossible contents of the capsule, the way the enforcers had appeared so quickly. Yes and no, Jessica replied. Their influence is vast, but fragile. It depends on maintaining a specific sequence of events. Disrupt enough of those events. She let the implication hang in the air. And we can break their hold on the timeline, I finished. She nodded. Exactly. That's why the capsules are so important. They're fulcrums, points where small changes can cascade into major divergences. We continued in silence for several minutes, the tunnel gradually sloping downward. The air grew cooler, damper. I checked my temporal anchor, 20 hours 47 minutes and 12 seconds remaining. What happens when the counter reaches 0? I asked. You return to the timeline you left, year 2024. But it might not be the same 2024 you remember. The changes we make ripple forward. And what about you? Will you return to your time? Jessica's expression darkened. My anchor was modified. I don't have a home timeline anymore. She pushed ahead, her stride lengthening as if to physically distance herself from the topic. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a small chamber with several diverging paths. Jessica chose one without hesitation, leading us down a passage that seemed newer than the others, the concrete less weathered, the lighting fixtures less corroded. The Bureau expanded the original network, she explained, noticing my observation. They've been preparing for decades, establishing infrastructure across multiple timelines. For what purpose? Control, Jessica said simply. Absolute control over human development. They believe they're creating the perfect future, eliminating uncertainty and chaos. What they're actually doing is strangling possibility, reducing the infinite potential of human existence to a single, predetermined path. The tunnel ended at a rusted metal door. Jessica produced a key from her pocket and unlocked it, revealing a staircase leading upward. We climbed in silence, emerging into what appeared to be a basement storage room filled with boxes and old furniture. Where are we? I asked as Jessica secured the door behind us. Safe house. Former Bureau outpost that they abandoned after a timeline shift. They don't know we know about it. She moved to a stack of boxes, retrieving a laptop that looked more advanced than any computer I'd seen in my time. We need to check if the replacement worked. How can we possibly know that already? Jessica typed rapidly, the screen illuminating her face with blue light. The capsules are connected to the time stream. When one is altered, it creates ripples that can be detected with the right equipment. She frowned at the screen. Something's wrong. There's no change signature. What does that mean? It means she was interrupted by a sound from above, footsteps, moving across the floor of whatever building we were in. Jessica quickly shut the laptop, plunging us into near darkness except for her flashlight, which she immediately dimmed. The footsteps grew closer, descending stairs that must lead to our location. Jessica drew me behind a large cabinet, her finger to her lips. The basement door opened. Light spilled down the stairs, followed by a figure, not the mechanical movement of an enforcer, but an ordinary person moving with natural human fluidity. Jessica, a male voice called softly. Are you here? Jessica's tension visibly eased. She stepped out from her hiding place. Thomas? Is that you? The figure moved into the light of her flashlight, an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes. But I recognized him immediately. Thomas Weaver, I breathed. He smiled grimly. Hello, Professor. It's been a while. For me, anyway. Thomas has been jumping longer than I have, Jessica explained. Different anchor modifications, different missions. Thomas nodded. And I bring bad news. The capsule you placed hasn't taken effect. The timeline isn't shifting. I just discovered the same thing, Jessica said, indicating her laptop. No change signature. What went wrong? I asked. I switched them exactly like I was supposed to. Thomas and Jessica exchanged glances. They must have implemented a verification protocol, Thomas said. The enforcer probably scanned the capsule after you left. Which means they've already replaced it with another Bureau capsule, Jessica added. We need to go back to the school. I checked my anchor, 19 hours, 23 minutes, and 45 seconds. We still have time. Barely, Thomas warned. Security will be tighter now. They'll be expecting another attempt. We don't have a choice, Jessica said firmly. If we don't replace that capsule, everything else we've done, everything we're still trying to do, falls apart. Thomas sighed, then nodded. I'll create a diversion. Give you 10 minutes to get in and out. He reached into his pocket and produced a small device about the size of a coin. Take this. It's a temporal signature masker. It won't fool an enforcer for long, but it might buy you enough time to get close. I took the device, slipping it into my pocket alongside the memory trigger my older self had given me. What kind of diversion are you planning? Thomas smiled, but there was no humor in it. The kind that's going to attract every enforcer within a mile radius. When you hear it, move fast. Jessica gripped his arm. Thomas, we can't risk losing you. You won't, he assured her. I've done this before, remember? Different timeline, same play. He checked his own temporal anchor. I've got just under 5 hours left before I snap back. Plenty of time to cause trouble and disappear. I admired his courage, even as I worried about the danger he was putting himself in. This older version of Thomas had a hardness to him that his teenage self lacked, the weight of years fighting an impossible war against enemies who could literally rewrite history. What's our plan? I asked. Jessica moved to another box, retrieving what looked like building plans. The school security will be focused on the main entrance and the administrative wing. We'll enter through the gymnasium, using the maintenance tunnels to reach the principal's office. And once we're there, we need to verify the capsule hasn't been replaced again, she explained. If it has, we'll need to switch it back to our version. And if there are enforcers guarding it? I asked. Jessica and Thomas exchanged glances. Then we improvise, she said grimly. We spent the next hour preparing, studying the school layout, synchronizing our watches, reviewing contingency plans. Thomas armed himself with several small devices whose purposes he didn't explain, and Jessica packed a backpack with equipment that looked far too advanced for 1994. As we prepared to leave, Thomas pulled me aside. There's something you should know, he said quietly, his voice too low for Jessica to hear. This isn't just about fixing the timeline. There's more at stake. What do you mean? His expression was grim. The Bureau doesn't just want to control history. They're trying to eliminate alternate timelines entirely, collapse all possible futures into a single, predetermined path. I struggled to comprehend the implications. That's genocide on a cosmic scale. Thomas nodded. Every choice creates branches in time, different possible futures. The Bureau sees this as inefficient, wasteful. They want one timeline, perfectly ordered according to their vision. He gripped my shoulder. Jessica doesn't know the full extent of it. She's never seen the collapse protocol like I have. Why are you telling me this? Because if we fail here, I need you to remember when you return to your time. Find me, the younger me. I left myself a message hidden in a place only I would know to look. He pressed something into my hand, a small key. This will help you find it. Before I could ask more questions, Jessica approached. It's time, she said. We need to move. We left the safe house through a back entrance, emerging into an alley behind what appeared to be an abandoned storefront. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, Pinewood High's main building was silhouetted against the fading light. Remember, Thomas said as we prepared to separate, when you hear the diversion, you'll have 10 minutes. Not a second more. Jessica nodded, her expression resolute. Be careful, Thomas. Always am, he replied with a wink that momentarily revealed the teenager I remembered beneath the weathered exterior. Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering shadows. Jessica and I made our way toward the school, keeping to side streets and alleyways. The town of Millbrook was both familiar and strange to me, buildings I knew in different configurations, businesses that in my time had long since closed, others that hadn't yet opened. What happens if we succeed? I asked as we walked. If we restore the timeline? Jessica's pace didn't falter. Best case? The Bureau's influence is weakened enough that we can target their main temporal anchor points. Unravel their control completely. And worst case? She glanced at me, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Worst case is what always happens. We make a change, they adapt, and the cycle continues. She paused, then added quietly, or we fail completely, and the collapse protocol activates. Thomas told me about that, I said. The elimination of alternate timelines. Jessica stopped walking, turning to face me fully. He told you? That's not like him. He's usually more. She trailed off, her eyes widening slightly. Unless in his timeline, it's already started. Before I could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath our feet. In the distance, a column of blue-white light erupted from the direction of the town center, shooting upward into the darkening sky. That's the diversion, Jessica said, already moving faster. We need to hurry. We ran the rest of the way to the school, reaching the athletic fields just as emergency vehicles began to race past in the opposite direction, sirens wailing. Whatever Thomas had done, it had the desired effect, drawing attention away from the school. The gymnasium doors were locked, but Jessica produced a small device that bypassed the mechanism in seconds. Inside, the building was dark and silent, the polished floor gleaming in the faint light from the windows. This way, Jessica whispered, leading me toward the equipment storage room. Inside, she moved directly to a rack of gymnastics mats, pushing them aside to reveal another access point to the maintenance tunnels. We descended into darkness once more, Jessica's flashlight our only guide. These tunnels were narrower than the ones we used earlier, forcing us to move in single file. How did you learn about these passages? I asked as we navigated the cramped space. From you, she replied. Or rather, from the version of you who first recruited me. He'd been mapping the Bureau's infrastructure for decades. My older self from the repository? Jessica hesitated. Not exactly. The timelines branch in complex ways. The you I first met was different. Harder. He'd been fighting the Bureau much longer. The implications of her words were dizzying. How many versions of myself were out there, battling across different timelines? How many had failed? How many had succeeded, only to see their work undone by the Bureau's machinations? We reached a junction in the tunnel, and Jessica consulted a small device that displayed a holographic map. The principal's office is directly above us, she whispered. There's an access panel in the closet. We climbed a narrow ladder, emerging into a dusty storage closet filled with office supplies. Jessica pressed her ear to the door, listening intently before nodding to me. Clear, she mouthed. We slipped into the outer office, which was dark and deserted. Through the glass partition, I could see Principal Hodges' office, also dark, but with a faint blue glow emanating from within. Scanner, Jessica whispered, pointing to the glow. They're checking the capsule. We crept closer, peering through the darkened glass. Inside the office, the copper capsule sat on the desk, bathed in the blue light of what appeared to be a portable scanning device. But there was no operator visible. Where's the enforcer? I whispered. As if in answer to my question, the office door opened. Two figures entered, both in the now familiar gray suits, both moving with that unsettling mechanical precision. They approached the capsule, one picking up the scanner while the other lifted the capsule itself. Jessica pulled me back from the window. They're switching it again, she breathed. We need to wait until they leave. We retreated to the storage closet, leaving the door cracked open just enough to see when the enforcers departed. Minutes ticked by, the tension building with each passing second. Finally, the office door opened again. The enforcers emerged, one carrying the scanner, the other empty-handed. They moved through the outer office and disappeared into the hallway beyond. Now, Jessica said, already moving toward the principal's office. Inside, the copper capsule sat on the desk, seemingly untouched. But the faint blue residue of the scanner's light still clung to its surface, revealing the truth. They replaced it, Jessica confirmed, examining the capsule without touching it. This is a Bureau version. She reached into her backpack, withdrawing an identical copper cylinder, another copy of the replacement capsule we brought from the repository. Stand back, she instructed. I need to neutralize their temporal markers first. Jessica produced a small device that emitted a soft golden light. She ran it over the Bureau's capsule, the light seeming to absorb the blue residue. This will prevent them from tracking the switch immediately, she explained. Once the blue glow had completely disappeared, Jessica carefully opened both capsules. As before, the contents looked nearly identical, genuine mementos from the class of 1994 mixed with the Bureau's subtle manipulations. We need to work quickly, Jessica said, beginning to transfer the genuine items from the Bureau's capsule to our replacement. They'll have sensors monitoring for temporal anomalies. I helped her, carefully sorting through photographs, letters, and small trinkets. Among them, I found a seemingly innocuous newspaper clipping about technological innovations, but with subtle alterations that would steer development away from certain paths. This is how they do it, I murmured. Small changes that compound over time. Jessica nodded grimly. A stock tip here, a technological nudge there. By the time anyone notices the divergence, it's too late to correct course. We finished the transfer, sealing our capsule and placing it on the desk exactly where the Bureau's version had been. Jessica used her device once more, this time to mask our temporal signatures from the capsule. "Done," she said, stowing the Bureau's capsule in her backpack. "Let's go." We had just reached the door to the outer office when a sound froze us in place, footsteps in the hallway outside, approaching with mechanical precision. "Back," Jessica hissed, pulling me toward the closet. But before we could reach it, the outer office door opened. An enforcer stepped in, its movements fluid yet wrong. It paused, head tilting slightly as if sensing something amiss. Then it spoke, its voice a flat, emotionless approximation of human speech. "Temporal anomaly detected. Identify yourselves." Jessica pushed me behind her, whispering urgently, "Run for the tunnels." "I'll hold it off." "I'm not leaving you," I protested. "You have to," she insisted. "Your anchor will pull you back soon. You need to be ready." Before I could argue further, Jessica stepped forward, facing the enforcer directly. "Verification Protocol Alpha 97 Delta," she said, her voice suddenly as flat and mechanical as the enforcer's own. The enforcer hesitated, its programming seemingly confused by the command. In that moment of uncertainty, Jessica moved with blinding speed, throwing something that exploded in a flash of golden light. The enforcer staggered, its form momentarily destabilizing, revealing beneath the human disguise a swirling mass of what looked like metallic particles suspended in a field of energy. "Go!" Jessica shouted, already moving to engage the disoriented enforcer. I hesitated for only a second before running for the storage closet. Behind me, I heard the sounds of struggle, Jessica and the enforcer, locked in combat. I wanted to help her, but I knew she was right. I had to make it back to my timeline with the knowledge we'd gained. I reached the closet and yanked open the access panel, practically throwing myself down the ladder into the tunnel below. The sounds of the confrontation faded as I descended, replaced by the pounding of my own heart and the rasp of my breath. I ran through the tunnels, following the path we'd taken earlier, praying that Jessica would be right behind me. But as I reached the gymnasium exit, I was still alone. I checked my anchor, 16 hours 42 minutes and 19 seconds remaining. I had to make a decision, wait for Jessica, or continue to the safe house where Thomas might return. A sudden vibration from my pocket startled me. It was the memory trigger my older self had given me, activating on its own. I pulled it out, watching as it projected a small holographic message. "Return to the repository entrance point. Temporal gateway instability detected. Collapse imminent." My blood ran cold. The collapse protocol Thomas had mentioned, was it happening already? I had to warn Jessica and Thomas, but I had no way to contact them. I made my decision. I would return to the football field, the point where we'd entered this timeline. If a gateway was forming there again, it might be our only chance to escape before the collapse. I left the gymnasium, moving cautiously across the darkened campus. The diversion Thomas had created was still evident, flashing lights and sirens in the distance, drawing attention away from the school. As I approached the football field, I saw it, the same shimmering distortion we jumped through to reach the repository, forming in the exact same location. But this one seemed unstable, its edges flickering and pulsing erratically. I checked my anchor again, 15 hours 3 minutes and 56 seconds. I still had time before being pulled back to my timeline. But the gateway was deteriorating rapidly. If I was going to use it, it had to be now. A shout from behind me made me turn. Jessica was running across the field, her clothes torn and singed from her confrontation with the enforcer. "Don't go near it," she called, sprinting toward me. "It's not a natural formation." I backed away from the distortion, waiting for her to reach me. "What do you mean?" "It's a trap," she gasped, reaching my side. "The Bureau is trying to pull us back to the repository, but their version of it, not the one we escaped from." "How do you know?" "The enforcer," she said grimly. "When I disrupted its form, I was able to access some of its data. They're implementing the collapse protocol already. They're trying to eliminate all divergent timelines, including ours." I stared at the shimmering distortion, which now seemed menacing rather than hopeful. "What do we do?" "We wait," Jessica said. "Let your anchor pull you back naturally. It's our best chance." "But what about you? And Thomas?" Jessica's expression was resolute. "We'll find another way. We always do." A distant explosion rocked the night, another of Thomas's diversions, or something worse. "We should find cover," Jessica said, leading me toward the bleachers. "The Bureau will be scanning for temporal signatures." We huddled beneath the metal stands, watching as the false gateway continued to pulsate. My anchor now read 14 hours, 17 minutes, and 32 seconds, still a long wait before I would return to my timeline. "If the collapse is happening," I asked Jessica, "what does that mean for my time? For the students I left behind?" Jessica's face was grim in the dim light. "It means their futures are being erased. All possible branches, all potential outcomes, reduced to a single path determined by the Bureau." "There has to be something we can do," I insisted. "There is," Jessica said, her voice lowering. "But it's dangerous. We need to access the Bureau's central chronometric array, the device they use to coordinate their temporal manipulations. If we could disrupt it, even briefly, it would stop the collapse. It would buy time," she corrected. "Enough for other resistance cells to implement countermeasures." "Other cells? There are more of us?" Jessica nodded. "Across multiple timelines, fighting the same battle from different angles." This revelation gave me hope. We weren't alone in this impossible war. But it also underscored the vastness of what we were fighting against. "How do we find this array?" I asked. "We don't," Jessica said. "Not in this timeline. But when you return to 2024, you'll need to find it there." She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small device similar to the memory trigger. "This contains the coordinates and access codes. When you return, use it to locate the array. But be careful, using it will alert the Bureau to your awareness." I took the device, securing it in my pocket alongside the memory trigger and the key Thomas had given me. "What about you and Thomas? How will you escape?" "We'll use the maintenance tunnels to reach the repository I showed you earlier. There's equipment there we can use to fortify our anchors, maybe even create a manual gateway." The sound of approaching vehicles made us both tense. Through the slats in the bleachers, I could see cars with tinted windows pulling into the school parking lot. "Bureau agents," Jessica whispered. "Not enforcers, human collaborators. They're searching for us." We pressed ourselves deeper into the shadows as flashlight beams began to sweep across the football field. One beam passed perilously close to our hiding spot, illuminating Jessica's face for a brief moment. "They're using temporal signature scanners," she said. "They'll find us soon." I checked my anchor again, 12 hours 45 minutes and 9 seconds. Still too long to wait. We need to move, Jessica decided. Head for the woods behind the school. The tree cover will help mask our signatures. We crawled from beneath the bleachers, keeping low as we made our way toward the tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the football field. The flashlight beams continued to sweep across the open ground, coming dangerously close several times. Jessica moved with practiced stealth, her decades of evading the Bureau evident in every calculated movement. I followed her lead, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it might give away our position. We had almost reached the trees when a shout went up. There! By the tree line! Run! Jessica hissed, abandoning stealth for speed. We sprinted the final distance, plunging into the dense undergrowth as flashlight beams converged on our position. Behind us, I heard car doors slamming, footsteps pounding across the field in pursuit. The woods were dark, the canopy blocking what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Jessica seemed to navigate by instinct, weaving between trees and leaping over fallen logs. I struggled to keep up, branches whipping against my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. This way, Jessica called softly, veering to the right. There's an old hunter's cabin about half a mile in. We can hide there until your anchor activates. I checked the device on my wrist, 11 hours 37 minutes and 22 seconds. Still an eternity with Bureau agents on our trail. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as we pushed deeper into the forest. Either we were outpacing them, or they had split up to search a wider area. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, a small structure materialized from the darkness, a dilapidated wooden cabin, its windows boarded up, its roof partially collapsed on one side. Jessica approached cautiously, checking the perimeter before gesturing me inside through a door hanging precariously from rusted hinges. The interior was musty and abandoned, cobwebs draping from the ceiling, leaves scattered across the floor where they had blown in through gaps in the walls. We should be safe here for a while, Jessica whispered, moving to a small window to peer through a crack in the boards. The Bureau's temporal scanners have limited range in dense organic material. The trees provide natural interference. I sank onto a rickety chair, my legs trembling from the exertion and fear. What about Thomas? Will he know to find us here? Jessica's expression darkened. If he can. That explosion we heard. She trailed off, unwilling to voice what we both feared. He said he'd done this before, I offered. That he knew how to escape. Yes, Jessica agreed, but her tone lacked conviction. Thomas is resourceful. A tense silence fell between us, broken only by the sounds of the forest and our own labored breathing. I checked my anchor again, 10 hours 52 minutes and 47 seconds. When I returned to my timeline, I said finally, what exactly should I expect? How different will things be? Jessica moved away from the window, settling onto the floor across from me. That depends on how successful we were. If the capsule replacement holds, you should notice subtle changes at first. Students making different choices. Historical events playing out slightly differently than you remember. And the collapse? If it's begun, you'll see more dramatic effects. Possibilities narrowing. People's behaviors becoming more predictable, more uniform. The Bureau calls it streamlining reality, but it's really the death of free will. I thought of my students, Thomas, Jessica, Daniel, their futures being narrowed to a single predetermined path. The thought was horrifying. The coordinates I gave you, Jessica continued, they'll lead you to the Bureau's chronometric array in your time. It's hidden beneath the old mining complex outside town. The one from the newspaper clipping in the capsule? The site of the mining disaster? Jessica nodded. The disaster was engineered by the Bureau to create the facility. They used the rescue operation as cover to build their temporal infrastructure underground. And no one noticed? People see what they expect to see. The Bureau is careful to operate within the bounds of plausibility. A sudden crack from outside silenced us both. Jessica was instantly on alert, moving back to the window with silent efficiency. Bureau agents, she whispered. 3 of them, about 200 yards south. They're using tracking equipment. I checked my anchor, 9 hours, 18 minutes, and 33 seconds. Still too long to wait here. What do we do? Jessica considered our options. We need to keep moving. Head deeper into the forest, toward the river. The water will mask our temporal signatures even better than the trees. We slipped out the back of the cabin, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. The night had grown colder, and a light rain had begun to fall, making the ground slick and treacherous. As we navigated the increasingly difficult terrain, Jessica suddenly froze, grabbing my arm to halt me. Ahead, a faint blue light pulsed among the trees, another temporal distortion forming. That's not a Bureau trap, Jessica whispered, studying the light with intense focus. The pattern is different. It's unstable, but it's natural. Another gateway? Possibly. The temporal fabric is thinning as the collapse progresses. Gateways are forming spontaneously, connecting points with similar quantum signatures. We approach cautiously. Unlike the controlled distortion on the football field, this one flickered erratically, its edges bleeding color like an oil slick on water. A figure emerged from the trees on the far side of the distortion, Thomas, his clothes torn and bloodied, but alive. He spotted us and raised a hand in warning, gesturing for us to stay back. Don't approach, he called, his voice barely audible over the strange humming emanating from the gateway. The temporal field is destabilizing. Multiple timelines converging. He limped toward us, giving the distortion a wide berth. The Bureau's activated their convergence protocol. They're trying to force all branch timelines back to their primary trunk. That's what the collapse is? I asked. A forced convergence? Thomas nodded grimly. And it's happening faster than we anticipated. We need to. He was cut off by a blinding flash from the distortion. The gateway expanded suddenly, its edges lashing out like tentacles of light. One grazed Thomas's arm, and he cried out in pain, the flesh seeming to phase in and out of existence where it had touched him. Run! Jessica shouted, pulling me back as the distortion continued to grow, consuming trees and undergrowth in its path. We fled, Thomas staggering after us, clutching his injured arm. Behind us, the forest was being devoured by the expanding gateway, reality itself torn apart and reconfigured. The river. Thomas gasped. It's our only chance. I could hear it now, the rush of water somewhere ahead. We pushed through a final stand of trees and found ourselves on a rocky bank overlooking a swift-flowing river, swollen by the rain. We need to cross, Jessica said. The water's temporal properties will disrupt the expansion. Can you swim? Thomas asked me, his face pale with pain. I nodded, though the churning waters looked far from inviting. Stay together, Jessica instructed. The current is strong. We waded in, the cold water shocking in its intensity. The current immediately began to pull at us, threatening to sweep us downstream. Jessica took the lead, with Thomas in the middle and me bringing up the rear. Halfway across, I checked my anchor, 7 hours 42 minutes and 19 seconds. The water seemed to be affecting it, the display flickering intermittently. Thomas suddenly lost his footing, crying out as the current pulled him under. Jessica and I both lunged for him, managing to grab his arms and keep his head above water. "My anchor," he gasped as we struggled toward the far shore. "It's malfunctioning." "The water..." He didn't finish. His body began to shimmer, becoming translucent then solid again in rapid pulses. "His anchor's failing," Jessica shouted. "We need to get to shore now." With desperate strength, we fought our way to the opposite bank, dragging Thomas onto the muddy ground. He lay there, shuddering, his form still fluctuating between solid and transparent. "What's happening to him?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "Temporal dissociation," Jessica explained, her voice tight with worry. "His anchor is no longer keeping him tethered to a specific timeline." Thomas looked up at us, his eyes surprisingly calm despite his condition. "It's the collapse," he said. "I'm being pulled back to the primary timeline." He gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Remember the key. Find what I left for you." His form flickered more violently, and he turned to Jessica. "The repository. The original. Before the Bureau. Find it." With those cryptic words, Thomas's body dissolved into particles of light that swirled briefly before vanishing completely. Jessica stared at the empty space where he had been, her expression a mixture of grief and determination. "He's not dead," she said, but whether to reassure me or herself, I couldn't tell. "Just relocated. Forcibly integrated into the Bureau's primary timeline." I checked my anchor, 6 hours 15 minutes and 42 seconds. "Will the same happen to me when this reaches zero?" "No," Jessica said. "Your anchor is functioning correctly. You'll return to your original departure point in 2024. But," she hesitated, "Thomas was right about the collapse progressing faster than we expected. Your 2024 may already be significantly altered." We sat in silence for a moment, the rain falling steadily around us. The expanding distortion had stopped at the river's edge, just as Jessica had predicted, creating a surreal boundary between normal forest and the shimmering void that had consumed the other bank. "We need to keep moving," Jessica said finally, rising to her feet. "The Bureau will have detected Thomas's dissociation. They'll send enforcers to investigate." We continued through the forest, moving parallel to the river. Jessica seemed to have a destination in mind, though she didn't share it with me. I followed, lost in thought about Thomas's fate and what awaited me upon my return. After nearly an hour of walking, we emerged from the trees into a small clearing. At its center stood a stone structure that resembled a well or a cistern, ancient-looking and covered in moss. "What is this place?" I asked as Jessica approached the structure. "One of the original temporal anchor points," she explained. "Built long before the Bureau, by people who understood the malleable nature of time." She ran her hands over the stone, searching for something. "The Bureau doesn't know about these. They're too subtle, too integrated with the natural flow of time." Her fingers found what they were seeking, a small indentation in the stone. She pressed it, and a section of the structure shifted, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "This will take us to a safe location," Jessica said. "A place outside the Bureau's surveillance. We can wait there until your anchor activates." I checked the device, 4 hours 37 minutes and 8 seconds. "What about you?" What happens when I'm gone? Jessica's expression was unreadable. I'll continue the fight. Find other allies. There are resistance cells throughout the timeline. We descended the stairs, which led to a small chamber illuminated by a soft, amber light that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. The room contained a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with ancient-looking books and strange devices. The keepers maintained these sanctuaries, Jessica explained. They understood that time is not a linear progression but a web of interconnected possibilities. The keepers? Another group fighting the Bureau? More like the Bureau's predecessors. They worked to maintain the balance of the timeline, ensuring that no single path dominated the others. She gestured to the books. Their knowledge was largely lost or corrupted when the Bureau rose to power. I examined one of the devices on the shelf, a brass mechanism resembling an astrolabe, but with additional rings and dials whose purpose I couldn't fathom. They called it a chronology, Jessica said, noticing my interest. It maps temporal disturbances, showing where the fabric between timelines is thinnest. I set the device down carefully. You know so much about all of this. How long have you been fighting the Bureau? Jessica settled into one of the chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. From my perspective, nearly 30 years. I was recruited right after I completed my mission at Princeton. A different version of you approached me, older, harder. Said I'd shown potential. And Thomas? Similar story, different timeline. We've crossed paths many times, never in the same way twice. That's the nature of this war, constantly shifting, timelines merging and diverging. I checked my anchor again, 3 hours, 12 minutes, and 54 seconds. What was Thomas trying to tell us at the end? About an original repository? Jessica leaned forward, her voice dropping as if she feared being overheard, even here. There's a theory among the resistance. The Bureau didn't create the technology they use, they discovered it. The original repository supposedly predates human civilization. Some believe it wasn't built by humans at all. Then who? She shrugged. No one knows. But if we could find it, access the original technology without the Bureau's corrupting influence. The implications were staggering. I thought back to the warehouse of capsules my older self had shown me, wondering if that was merely a pale imitation of something far more ancient and powerful. When you return, Jessica continued, things will be different. The changes we've made, replacing the capsule, disrupting the Bureau's operations, will have altered your timeline in ways you may not immediately recognize. How will I know what's changed? What's right? Jessica reached into her pocket and withdrew a small, crystalline object that glowed with an inner light. This is a temporal constant. One of the few things that remains unchanged across all timelines. She pressed it into my hand. If you're ever unsure about a memory, a person, an event, touch this. It will show you the truth as it exists across all possible realities. I accepted the crystal, feeling its warmth pulsing against my palm. Thank you. One more thing, Jessica said, her expression grave. Daniel Porter. In your timeline, he was reported missing the day of the capsule opening. Yes. We found his photo in the capsule, in military uniform. He's crucial to all of this. More than you know. When you return, finding him must be your priority. Why? What's special about Daniel? Jessica hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. In some timelines, he becomes a key Bureau operative. In others, he leads the resistance. His choices, his potential, represent a fulcrum point in the temporal war. I thought back to the quiet junior who rarely spoke in class. What was it about him that made him so important? My anchor beeped softly. 1 hour and 30 minutes. 90 minutes remaining. We should rest while we can, Jessica suggested. You'll need your strength when you return. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Despite everything, I found myself dozing off, the stress and exertion of the past hours taking their toll. I awoke with a start to Jessica shaking my shoulder. Something's wrong, she whispered urgently. The sanctuary's defenses have been breached. I checked my anchor, 15 minutes and 42 seconds. Just minutes remaining. How is that possible? I asked, rising quickly to my feet. You said the Bureau doesn't know about these places. They shouldn't, Jessica replied, gathering her equipment. Unless. Her expression darkened. Unless the collapse has progressed further than we thought. Realities merging, secrets revealing themselves. A low rumble shook the chamber, dust raining down from the ceiling. They're trying to collapse the entrance, Jessica said. We need to move. There's another exit. She led me to what appeared to be a blank wall, pressing her hand against it in a specific pattern. The stone shifted, revealing another passage. This leads to the surface, about a mile from here, she explained. Go. Your anchor will activate soon. You need to be above ground when it does. What about you? I'll hold them off. Buy you time. She saw my expression and smiled grimly. Don't worry about me. This isn't my first escape. The rumbling grew louder, cracks appearing in the ceiling of the chamber. Go! Jessica insisted, pushing me toward the passage. Remember, find Daniel Porter. Use the temporal constant. Locate the chronometric array. I hesitated, reluctant to leave her facing unknown dangers alone. Will I see you again? Jessica's smile was sad. Not this version of me. But somewhere, someone, we'll meet again. With that promise, I turned and entered the passage. It was narrow and winding, roughly hewn from the bedrock. I moved as quickly as I could, checking my anchor periodically. 10 minutes and 23 seconds. 7 minutes and 16 seconds. 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Behind me, I heard distant sounds of struggle, crashes, strange electronic whines that must be enforcer weapons. I fought the urge to turn back, to help Jessica. My mission now was to return to my timeline, to use what I'd learned to continue the fight. Have you ever felt eyes on you when no one was around? That prickling sensation at the back of your neck that tells you something is watching, waiting? I used to jog through Blackwood Park every evening after work. The quiet paths winding through ancient oaks and vibrant flower beds were my sanctuary from the chaos of Atlanta's bustling downtown. The park was nestled in a forgotten corner of the city, a place where time seemed to slow down, where the noise of traffic faded into the background, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and chirping of birds. My name is Michael, and I work as a night shift nurse at Mercy Hospital. My schedule leaves me with odd hours to exercise, which is why I often found myself alone in the park as twilight descended. I enjoyed the solitude, or at least I did, until that Thursday evening in late October. The air was crisp that day, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the faint promise of rain. As I stretched beside the worn wooden bench near the park entrance, I noticed how the shadows seemed longer than usual, darker somehow. The wind picked up, sending a shower of amber leaves spiraling around my feet. I pulled my headphones on and started my usual route, the familiar path now bathed in the golden glow of sunset. 20 minutes into my run, the music in my ears suddenly cut out. I slowed to a walk, fiddling with my phone, when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, yet too deep to be a purr. I froze, scanning the trees lining the path. The rational part of my brain suggested it must be a stray dog or perhaps a raccoon. But something about that sound made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "Anyone there?" The only response was the rustling of leaves, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I resumed my jog, picking up my pace slightly. The park had never felt threatening before, but now the gathering darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I rounded a bend in the path and came to an abrupt halt. 20 yards ahead, a figure sat motionless in the middle of the trail. In the fading light, I could only make out a silhouette, too large for a house cat, too small for a human. Its outline was sleek, feline, with pointed ears that twitched slightly as I approached. "Here, kitty," I called softly, though something told me this was no ordinary cat. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply sat there, watching. I took a tentative step forward, then another. As I drew closer, details began to emerge. The creature was indeed a cat, a massive black cat with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Its eyes reflected the dying sunlight, two glowing amber orbs fixed unblinkingly on me. My heart raced, but I tried to reason with myself. It was just a cat, probably someone's pet that had wandered into the park. Yet as I drew nearer, the cat's size became more apparent. It was easily the size of a large dog, its muscular shoulders hunched as if ready to pounce. "Nice kitty," I murmured, slowing my approach. "Are you lost?" The cat's tail twitched once, a deliberate movement that sent a chill down my spine. Its eyes never left mine, and I felt an odd pressure building in my head, as if the air around me had suddenly become too thick to breathe. I stopped, unsure whether to continue forward or retreat. The cat rose to its feet in one fluid motion, its movements unnaturally smooth. It took a step toward me, and I noticed something odd about its paws. They seemed to leave no imprint on the dirt path. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by those burning amber eyes. The cat took another step forward, and another, its gaze never wavering. When it was just a few feet away, I finally broke free from my trance and stumbled backward. The cat stopped, its head tilting slightly as if curious about my reaction. Then, without warning, it let out a sound that was neither a meow nor a growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate inside my skull rather than through the air. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, didn't slow down until I reached the park entrance. Only then did I dare to glance over my shoulder. The path behind me was empty. The cat was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those burning amber orbs staring back at me. I told myself it was just an unusually large cat, perhaps a Maine Coon that had escaped from someone's home. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The next morning, I woke with a slight fever and a strange rash on my left arm, right where the shadow of the cat had fallen as it approached me. I didn't return to the park that evening, or the next. But on the third night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a sound outside my window, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, yet too deep to be a purr. And I knew the cat had found me. The scratching at my window continued for 3 nights straight. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, the kind of sound you could easily dismiss as branches scraping against glass or the settling of an old building. But there were no trees near my second-floor apartment, and the building was barely 5 years old. Each night, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. I would lie awake, staring at the dark rectangle of my window, the curtains drawn tight. Sometimes, I swore I could see the fabric move, as if something on the other side was pushing against it. The fever that had started after my encounter in the park hadn't subsided. If anything, it had grown worse. The rash on my arm had spread, forming intricate patterns that resembled claw marks. My doctor was baffled, prescribing antibiotics and suggesting I see a dermatologist. "I've never seen anything quite like this," he admitted, his brow furrowed as he examined my arm. "Have you been in contact with any unusual plants or animals recently?" I thought about mentioning the cat, but decided against it. How could I explain that I believed a supernatural feline was stalking me? That I thought it had somehow marked me, cursed me? No, I lied. Nothing unusual. At work, I began to notice changes. The fluorescent lights of the hospital suddenly seemed too bright, causing splitting headaches that no amount of painkillers could touch. Sounds were amplified, the beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the whispered conversations of visitors, all of it crashed against my eardrums like waves against rocks. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, terrifying dreams where I was running through endless corridors of trees, the pounding of heavy paws always just behind me. In these dreams, I could never escape, never find my way out of the labyrinth of branches and shadows. And always, there were those amber eyes, watching from the darkness. A week after my encounter in the park, I received a call from the hospital asking me to cover a shift for a colleague who had fallen ill. Despite my own deteriorating health, I agreed. The distraction of work was preferable to another night lying awake, listening for scratching at my window. The night shift was quiet, the hospital corridors dimly lit and eerily silent. As I made my rounds, checking on patients, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Several times, I turned quickly, certain I would catch someone, or something, watching me from the shadows. But there was never anything there. Around 3 in the morning, I was updating a patient's chart at the nurse's station when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then darkness. The emergency generators kicked in almost immediately, bathing the corridor in a soft, amber glow. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a large, dark shape sat motionless, its outline barely visible against the shadows. But its eyes, those burning amber eyes, were unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fever and exhaustion. But when I opened my eyes, the cat was still there, watching me. "Dr. Reynolds?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No response. The corridor remained silent, save for the distant hum of machinery and the pounding of my own heart. I took a step back, my hand fumbling for the phone at the nurse's station. But before I could reach it, the cat moved. It stood, stretched languidly, and began to walk toward me with that same unnaturally fluid motion I had witnessed in the park. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, knocking over a stack of files in my haste. Papers scattered across the floor, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on the approaching cat, its amber gaze never leaving mine. As it drew closer, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The cat cast no shadow in the amber emergency lighting. It moved as if it were made of smoke, its paws making no sound on the linoleum floor. "Stay back," I whispered, though I knew the command was futile. This was no ordinary animal, no creature that would respond to human commands. The cat paused, its head tilting slightly as if it were considering my words. Then, with a movement so swift I barely saw it happen, it leaped onto the counter of the nurse's station, now on a level with me. Up close, I could see details I had missed before. Its fur wasn't just black, it seemed to absorb light, creating a void in the shape of a cat. Its eyes, those hypnotic amber orbs, contained flecks of gold that seemed to shift and swirl like flames. And its teeth, revealed now in what almost looked like a smile, were too numerous, too sharp for any natural feline. "What are you?" I breathed, unable to look away from those mesmerizing eyes. The cat didn't answer, of course it didn't, but it leaned forward, and I felt that same pressure in my head that I had experienced in the park. A buzzing, like static electricity, filled my ears. The rash on my arm began to burn, the pain so intense I gasped. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the cat was gone. The lights flickered back on, flooding the corridor with harsh fluorescent light. I stood there, trembling, wondering if I had imagined the whole encounter. But the burning sensation in my arm remained, and when I rolled up my sleeve, I saw that the rash had changed. The claw-like marks were now deeper, more pronounced, and seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I made it through the rest of my shift in a daze, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound. When morning came, I practically ran from the hospital, desperate to get home, to lock myself away from those burning amber eyes. But as I approached my apartment building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the sidewalk leading to the entrance, a trail of wet paw prints glistened in the morning light. They led straight to the door of my building, and they were far too large to belong to any ordinary cat. I followed the prints with my eyes, my heart hammering in my chest. They led into the building, up the stairs, and stopped at my door. Whatever this thing was, it knew where I lived. It had followed me home. And I had a terrible feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. With shaking hands, I unlocked my door and stepped inside, half expecting to find the cat waiting for me. But the apartment was empty, silent. I locked the door behind me, checked every room, every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I moved to close the curtains against the morning light, I noticed something on the window glass. Scratch marks, deep and deliberate, forming a pattern that looked almost like writing. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The scratches formed words, impossible words that no cat should be able to write. "I see you. Is it possible to catch a nightmare? To become infected with something that exists beyond the realm of science and reason?" 2 weeks after my first encounter with the black cat, I was no longer able to work. The fever had escalated, sending my temperature soaring to 104 degrees. The rash had spread from my arm to my chest, my back, creeping up my neck like ivy climbing a wall. The pain was constant, a burning sensation that felt as if my skin was being peeled away one layer at a time. I had been to 3 different doctors, undergone countless tests. Blood work, skin biopsies, MRIs, all came back inconclusive. Idiopathic dermatitis, they called it. A fancy way of saying they had no idea what was happening to me. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. The cat had marked me, cursed me. And now I was paying the price for our encounter. My apartment had become my prison. I covered all the windows with thick blankets, unable to bear the thought of those amber eyes watching me from the darkness. I kept every light on, day and night, afraid of what might emerge from the shadows if I allowed them to deepen. Sleep was elusive, coming in brief, fitful snatches that left me more exhausted than before. And when I did sleep, the dreams were waiting, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was no longer running from the cat, but becoming it. In these nightmares, I would look down at my hands only to see them transform into paws, my skin giving way to sleek black fur that absorbed all light. I would wake from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the sheets tangled around my legs. And always, there would be new scratches on the window, new messages that made my blood run cold. Soon. Becoming. Mine. I tried to convince myself that I was hallucinating, that the fever was causing me to see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. The cat was real. Its curse was real. And whatever was happening to me was only going to get worse. On the 17th day after my encounter in the park, I woke to find I could no longer speak. My throat felt raw, as if I had been screaming for hours, but I had no memory of doing so. When I tried to call out, no sound emerged, only a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. That same day, I noticed another change. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was wrong. My eyes, once a deep brown, now held flecks of amber that seemed to catch the light in unnatural ways. My pupils had changed shape, becoming more elliptical, more feline. I stumbled away from the mirror, knocking over bottles of pills that I had been taking in a desperate attempt to control the fever. They clattered into the sink, some falling to the floor, their contents spilling across the tiles. I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on my hands, which had begun to itch unbearably. I watched in horror as my nails began to change, growing longer, curving slightly, becoming more like claws. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. Whatever was happening to me, it was accelerating. The transformation that had haunted my dreams was becoming reality. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. But my fingers, now awkward and unfamiliar, fumbled with the screen. And when I finally managed to dial, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't speak to explain what was happening. I dropped the phone, my breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. I needed help, needed someone to see what was happening to me before it was too late. With trembling hands, I unlocked my apartment door and stumbled into the hallway, hoping to find a neighbor, anyone who could help. The hallway was empty, silent. I made my way to the nearest door and pounded on it with my fist, desperate for someone to answer. But there was no response. I tried another door and another, my knocking becoming more frantic with each unanswered plea. Finally, a door opened. Mrs. Ellington, an elderly woman who lived at the end of the hall, peered out cautiously. "Michael? Is that you? What's wrong, dear?" I tried to speak, to explain, but again, only that low, rumbling growl emerged from my throat. Mrs. Ellington's eyes widened in alarm. She took a step back, her hand moving to her throat. "Michael? Are you ill?" I nodded frantically, pointing to my throat, then to my eyes, trying to make her understand that something was happening to me, something beyond my control. But as I moved closer, trying to communicate my desperation, Mrs. Ellington's expression changed from concern to fear. She was looking at me as if I were a stranger, a threat. "Your eyes," she whispered, backing away. "What's happened to your eyes?" I reached out, trying to reassure her, but the movement only seemed to frighten her more. She recoiled, slamming the door shut. I heard the lock click into place, followed by the sound of a chain being drawn across. Defeated, I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. What had she seen in my eyes that had frightened her so? I needed to see for myself, needed to understand what was happening to me. I dragged myself back to my apartment, my limbs feeling heavier with each step. The fever was getting worse, the rash now a constant, burning presence that covered most of my body. I could feel changes happening beneath my skin, muscles shifting, bones reforming. Back in my bathroom, I forced myself to look in the mirror again. What I saw made me recoil in horror. My eyes were no longer just flecked with amber, they had transformed completely, the irises now a burning gold, the pupils vertical slits that expanded and contracted as I watched. My face seemed elongated, my features sharper, more angular. And my teeth. I opened my mouth and saw that my canines had lengthened, become more pointed. I ran my tongue over them, feeling their sharpness, and tasted blood, my blood. A sound escaped me then, a sound of pure terror that was neither human nor animal but something caught between the two. I stumbled backward, away from the mirror, away from the truth it revealed. I was changing, transforming, becoming something else entirely. In a desperate attempt to halt the transformation, I filled the bathtub with cold water and ice from my freezer, hoping to bring down the fever that I was certain was driving this nightmarish metamorphosis. I stripped off my clothes, wincing as the fabric dragged across my hypersensitive skin, and lowered myself into the frigid water. The shock of the cold was immediate, sending my body into violent shivers. But the relief was short-lived. Within minutes, the water around me began to warm, as if my fever was so intense it could heat the entire tub. I lay there, watching the steam rise from the surface of the water, feeling the changes continue despite my efforts to stop them. My limbs ached, my muscles spasming as they reconfigured themselves. My spine felt as if it were being stretched, elongated. And all the while, the rash burned, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. As I lay in the rapidly warming water, a sudden realization came to me. The park. I needed to go back to the park. Whatever had started there might be the key to stopping this transformation before it was complete. With what little strength I had left, I pulled myself out of the tub, water sluicing off my transformed body. I didn't bother drying off, just pulled on the loosest clothes I could find, a pair of sweatpants and a hoodie to hide my face. Night had fallen while I was in the bath, the city outside my window now dark save for the glow of streetlights. Perfect. The darkness would hide the worst of my transformation from curious eyes. I made my way out of the apartment building, keeping my head down, my head pulled low over my face. The streets were mercifully quiet, most people already home for the evening. Those few who passed me gave me a wide berth, perhaps sensing something off, something dangerous. The walk to Blackwood Park took twice as long as it should have, my new body awkward and unfamiliar. My movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as if I were a puppet being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. When I finally reached the park gates, I paused, suddenly afraid. What if the cat was waiting for me? What if this was exactly what it wanted, to lure me back to where it all began? But I had no choice. Whatever was happening to me was accelerating. If I didn't find answers soon, there would be nothing left of Michael to save. I entered the park, the familiar paths now alien in the darkness. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Shadows stretched long and dark, and in every one, I imagined I saw the silhouette of a massive cat, watching, waiting. I made my way to the spot where I had first encountered the creature, my feet somehow remembering the way even as my mind struggled to focus through the haze of fever. The clearing looked different at night, the trees forming a perfect circle around a patch of grass that seemed to glow softly in the moonlight. As I stepped into the clearing, a sudden stillness fell over the park. The distant sounds of traffic ceased, the rustle of leaves and the wind went silent. It was as if the world had taken a breath and held it, waiting. And then I saw it. The cat. Sitting in the center of the clearing, its amber eyes locked on mine, its tail twitching slowly back and forth. We regarded each other in silence, predator and prey, though I was no longer certain which was which. The cat seemed larger than before, its sleek black form absorbing all light, creating a void in the shape of a feline. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but only that low, rumbling growl emerged from my throat. The cat's ears twitched, and I swore I saw amusement in those burning amber eyes. It rose to its feet, stretching languidly, and began to circle me. I turned, keeping it in my sights, afraid to let it get behind me. But it was fast, impossibly fast, and soon I was spinning, disoriented, the world blurring around me. And then it spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but directly into my mind. A voice that was ancient and terrible, a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and reverberate through my very bones. "You return," it said, its mental voice a purr that sent shivers down my spine. "As I knew you would." I tried to respond, to ask what it wanted from me, why it had chosen me. But my thoughts were sluggish, difficult to form. What happening to me? I managed to project, unsure if the cat could hear my primitive attempt at telepathy. The cat's tail twitched, its eyes narrowing slightly. "You are becoming," it replied, "as all who see me must become." Becoming what? I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. The cat's mental voice was smug, satisfied. "Becoming me. Becoming us. The shadows have been thin for too long. We need new hunters." With those words, a flood of images cascaded through my mind, memories that were not my own. I saw countless humans throughout history, each experiencing the same transformation I was undergoing. I saw them hunting in parks, in forests, in the shadows of cities. I saw them passing the curse to others, creating more of their kind. I saw what I was becoming, a guardian of the threshold between this world and another, a hunter that stalked the boundaries between realities. "No," I tried to say, tried to think. "I don't want this." The cat's mental laughter was cold, cruel. "It is not a matter of want. It is a matter of need. The balance must be maintained. New hunters must be chosen." It moved closer, its massive form now just inches from mine. I could feel its breath, hot and fetid, on my face. "The change is already far advanced," it continued. "By dawn, you will be as I am. And then you will understand the hunger, the need to mark others, to create more of our kind." Horror washed over me as I realized the truth. This wasn't just about me. This was about what I would become, what I would do to others. I would be compelled to spread this curse, to transform innocent people just as I had been transformed. "I won't," I thought fiercely. "I won't do that to anyone." The cat's mental voice was amused, condescending. "You say that now, human. But when the hunger comes, you will have no choice. It is our nature. It is what we are." With those words, it leaped at me, its massive form colliding with mine, sending me sprawling onto the grass. I felt its weight on my chest, its hot breath on my face. Its amber eyes bored into mine, and I felt something pass between us, a final gift, a final curse. Knowledge. understanding, the full awareness of what I was becoming and what it would mean. And as that knowledge flooded through me, the transformation accelerated. I felt my body changing, twisting, bones cracking, muscles reforming. The pain was excruciating, beyond anything I had ever experienced. I screamed, the sound starting as a human cry of agony but ending as a feline roar that echoed through the park. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was the cat, watching me with those burning amber eyes, its mental voice a whisper in my mind. Welcome to the hunt, brother. When does a human stop being human? Is it when their body changes, or when their mind surrenders to something else entirely? I awoke to the sound of birds chirping, the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees above me. For a moment, I was disoriented, confused as to why I was lying on damp grass in the middle of Blackwood Park. Then the memories came rushing back, the cat, the confrontation, the excruciating pain of transformation. I sat up abruptly, my hands flying to my face, expecting to feel fur, a muzzle, whiskers. But my fingers touched human skin, human features. I looked down at my body, still clothed in the sweatpants and hoodie I had worn to the park, still recognizably human. Had it all been a fever dream? A hallucination brought on by whatever strange illness had overtaken me? I got to my feet, my body aching as if I had run a marathon. The rash that had covered my skin was gone, the fever that had burned through me for weeks had subsided. I felt normal, human. Relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. I laughed, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet morning air. It had been a nightmare, nothing more. I was still Michael, still human. But as I turned to leave the clearing, something caught my eye, a flash of movement in the periphery of my vision. I froze, scanning the trees surrounding the clearing. There was nothing there, no sign of the massive black cat that had haunted my dreams. I shook my head, trying to clear away the last vestiges of paranoia. It was over. I was cured. Whatever strange illness had afflicted me had broken in the night, leaving me weak but human. I made my way out of the park, my steps growing steadier as I walked. The early morning streets were quiet, just a few cars passing by, their drivers giving no indication that they saw anything unusual about a disheveled man walking home at dawn. When I reached my apartment building, I hesitated before the entrance, half expecting to see those wet paw prints leading to my door. But the sidewalk was dry, unmarked. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and went inside. My apartment was exactly as I had left it, lights still blazing, bathtub still filled with now tepid water, pill bottles scattered across the bathroom floor. I moved through the rooms, turning off lights, gathering up the detritus of my illness. As I passed the bathroom mirror, I caught sight of my reflection and paused. I looked different. Not in any obvious way, not in any way that would cause alarm. But there was something about my eyes, something about the set of my features that seemed subtly altered. I leaned closer, studying my reflection. My irises were their normal brown, no trace of amber or gold. My pupils were round, not vertical slits. My teeth, when I bared them at my reflection, were normal human teeth. And yet, there was a wildness in my gaze now, a predatory awareness that hadn't been there before. My movements, as I turned away from the mirror, were more fluid, more graceful than they had ever been. I told myself it was nothing, just the lingering effects of fever and fear. I was Michael, human, unchanged. The nightmare was over. I stripped off my clothes and stepped into the shower, letting hot water wash away the sweat and grime of the night. As the water cascaded over me, I noticed something else. My senses seemed heightened, more acute. I could smell the individual components of my soap, could hear the conversation of my neighbors through the wall with perfect clarity, could feel each individual droplet of water as it struck my skin. Again, I dismissed it as nothing more than the aftermath of illness. When you've been sick, recovery can make ordinary sensations seem extraordinary. After my shower, exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. I staggered to my bed, barely managing to pull on a pair of boxers before collapsing onto the mattress. Sleep took me immediately, dragging me down into darkness. I dreamed of hunting. In my dream, I moved through the park with liquid grace, my paws making no sound on the soft earth. The night was alive with scents and sounds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant laughter of humans oblivious to the predator in their midst. I was powerful, unstoppable. The hunger drove me forward, a need more primal than anything I had ever known. I needed to mark another, to pass on the gift/curse that had been given to me. And then I saw him, a jogger, alone, his music too loud to hear my approach. I crouched, muscles coiling, ready to spring. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding. The dream had been so vivid, so real. I could still taste the night air, still feel the surge of predatory anticipation as I prepared to pounce. Outside my window, darkness had fallen again. I had slept the entire day away. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the dream. As my hand fell away from my face, I froze. In the dim light filtering through my window, I could see that my nails had lengthened, curved slightly, become more like claws. No, it couldn't be. I scrambled out of bed, nearly falling in my haste to reach the bathroom mirror. I flipped on the light, wincing at the sudden brightness, and stared at my reflection. My eyes, once brown, now held definite flecks of amber that caught the light in unnatural ways. My pupils, when I leaned close to examine them, were not quite round anymore, but slightly elongated, slightly vertical. And my teeth. I opened my mouth and saw that my canines had lengthened, become more pointed. Not dramatically, not enough to be immediately noticeable to a casual observer, but the change was unmistakable. The transformation hadn't been halted. It had just been paused, slowed, and now it was continuing, advancing with the setting of the sun. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. I stumbled backward, away from the mirror, away from the truth it revealed. I was changing, still changing, still becoming whatever the cat had intended me to become. And worse, much worse, was the hunger that gnawed at me now. A hunger that had nothing to do with food, nothing to do with human needs. A hunger to hunt, to mark, to transform. I fought against it, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could physically contain the predator stirring within me. This couldn't be happening. I wouldn't let it happen. But even as I denied it, I could feel the changes accelerating. My skin itched, not with the burning rash of before, but with the sensation of fur trying to push its way through. My bones ached, shifting subtly, reconfiguring themselves into a new shape. And the hunger was becoming impossible to ignore. I needed to get out, needed to get away from people before I did something unforgivable. With shaking hands, I pulled on clothes, not caring what I grabbed. I had to get back to the park, back to where this had all started. Maybe there, in that clearing, I could find a way to stop this before it was too late. The night air hit me like a physical blow as I stepped outside, carrying 1,000 scents that my newly enhanced senses could now identify. Human sweat, car exhaust, the lingering traces of perfume and cologne, the distant aroma of cooking food from nearby apartments. and beneath it all, the scent of prey. Humans moving through the night, unaware of the predator now walking among them. The hunger surged, nearly overwhelming me. I staggered, leaning against a wall for support. No, I wouldn't give in. I wouldn't give in. I wouldn't become the monster the cat wanted me to be. With tremendous effort, I pushed away from the wall and forced myself to move toward the park. Each step was a battle against the hunger that clawed at my insides, demanding satisfaction. The world around me seemed sharper, more vibrant than before, colors more intense, sounds more distinct, scents more intoxicating. I was experiencing the world through new senses, predator senses, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. The streets were not empty. Late-night revelers stumbled from bars, couples walked hand in hand, night shift workers hurried to their destinations. Each human I passed sent a spike of hunger through me, so intense I had to clench my jaw to keep from crying out. I could hear their heartbeats, smell their fear or excitement or exhaustion. I could almost taste their humanity. And with each passing minute, I felt less and less of my own. By the time I reached Blackwood Park, the transformation had progressed further. My hands were no longer quite hands, the fingers shorter, thicker, the nails now unmistakably claws. My spine had curved, forcing me into a slight hunch. And I could feel the pressure of fangs against my lips, too large now to be contained comfortably in a human mouth. The park was dark, deserted. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting everything in silver light. I made my way to the clearing where I had first encountered the cat, where I had experienced the first agonizing moments of transformation the night before. The clearing was empty, peaceful. No sign of the massive black feline that had changed my life forever. I stood in the center, my distorted shadow stretching across the grass, and waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Answers? Salvation? The final stages of a transformation I could no longer deny was happening? I know you're watching, I called out, my voice a raspy growl that barely resembled human speech. Show yourself. Silence answered me, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I turned slowly, scanning the trees surrounding the clearing. Nothing moved in the shadows, yet I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then I felt it, a presence in my mind, a voice that wasn't a voice, bypassing my ears and speaking directly into my thoughts. You fight it, the voice said, and I recognized it as the cat's mental purr. They all fight it at first. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the clearing remained empty. Where are you? I demanded, the words coming out as a feral snarl. Everywhere, came the reply. Nowhere. I am where I need to be. Rage surged through me, hot and wild. You did this to me. Change me back. Mental laughter, cold and amused, echoed in my skull. There is no going back, Hunter. Only forward. Only becoming. I won't, I growled, even as another wave of transformation rippled through me, bringing me to my knees in the damp grass. I won't hunt. I won't mark others. You will, the voice assured me. When the hunger becomes too great to bear, you will hunt. You will mark. You will create more of our kind. It is inevitable. Why? I gasped, fighting through the pain. Why me? Why any of us? For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice returned, softer now, almost contemplative. The space between worlds grows thin in certain places. Shadows from one reality bleed into another. We are the guardians of these thresholds. We keep the balance. Images flash through my mind, glimpses of creatures that should not exist, that could not exist in our world. Monstrous things that lurked in the spaces between realities, waiting for a chance to break through. Without us, the voice continued, the barriers would weaken. The shadows would deepen. And what lives in the deep shadows would find its way into your world. I saw it then, the true purpose of the cat, of all like it. They were not monsters, but guardians, keeping watch over the weak places in reality. Marking humans to create more guardians, more watchers to maintain the balance. You were chosen, the voice said, because you saw me. Because you could see me. Not everyone can. It takes a certain sensitivity, a certain awareness of the world beyond the veil. I thought back to that evening in the park, how the cat had seemed to be waiting for me, how it had watched me with those intelligent amber eyes. It had been testing me, seeing if I was one who could perceive it. And in seeing it, I had sealed my fate. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice barely human now. Few do, the voice replied. But necessity does not require consent. Another wave of transformation hit me, more intense than before. I fell forward, my hands, no, my paws, digging into the soft earth. My clothes tore as my body reconfigured itself, bones cracking, muscles reshaping, skin giving way to sleek black fur. The pain was excruciating, but brief. And when it passed, I was no longer Michael. No longer human. I was something else entirely. I rose on 4 legs, my senses now almost overwhelming in their acuity. I could hear the heartbeat of a mouse 50 yards away, could smell the lingering scent of every human who had passed through the park that day. The night was no longer dark to me, but bathed in shades of silver and blue, every detail crystal clear. And the hunger was an entity unto itself, a driving force that demanded satisfaction. Now you understand, the voice said, and suddenly the cat was there, sitting at the edge of the clearing. Its massive form was exactly as I remembered, its amber eyes fixed on mine. Now you feel it. I did. I felt the hunger, the need to mark, to create another like myself. But I also felt something else, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. The images the cat had shown me of the things that lurked beyond the veil, the things we were keeping at bay, they remained vivid in my mind. There must be another way, I thought, projecting the words toward the cat. There is not, it replied simply. The balance must be maintained. New guardians must be created. And if I refuse? The cat's tail twitched, its eyes narrowing slightly. Then the hunger will consume you, drive you mad, and you will mark dozens, hundreds, in your madness. Or you will die, and the threshold you were meant to guard will weaken. I saw the truth of it in the cat's eyes. This was not a choice between marking someone and not marking someone. It was a choice between marking one, carefully chosen, or marking many in a frenzy of hunger and madness. How do I choose? I asked, resignation coloring my thoughts. You will know, the cat replied. As I knew with you. You will sense those who can see beyond the veil, those with the sensitivity to perceive what others cannot. And from among them, you will choose one. The cat rose, stretching languidly. Your territory is this park and the surrounding area. You will patrol it, guard it, keep watch over the threshold it contains. And when the time comes, you will mark your successor. With those words, the cat turned and walked away, its form seeming to melt into the shadows until it was gone, leaving me alone in the clearing. I stood there for a long time, adjusting to my new form, my new senses, my new reality. The hunger was there, a constant presence, but now that I understood its purpose, I found I could control it better. I could channel it, direct it, use it rather than be used by it. That night, I explored my territory, learning its boundaries, its secret places. I found the threshold the cat had spoken of, a spot deep in the park where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should be, where the air hummed with an energy that made my fur stand on end. And I watched. I kept guard. I became the protector of that place, the guardian of the threshold between worlds. Weeks passed. I adapted to my new existence, learning to hunt small game to sustain myself, to move unseen through the night, to blend into the shadows when humans passed by. During the day, I could assume a form that was almost human, enough to pass cursory inspection, enough to maintain the apartment I now rarely visited. But at night, I was the guardian, the watcher, the protector of the threshold. And always, the hunger remained, a reminder of the task that still lay before me. I saw many humans in my territory. Some passed through quickly, oblivious to the world beyond the veil. Others lingered, drawn perhaps by some subconscious awareness of the energy that pulsed at the heart of the park. And then one evening, as autumn gave way to winter, I saw her. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, sitting on a bench near the threshold. She was sketching, her pencil moving rapidly over the paper. But it was not her activity that caught my attention, it was the way she kept glancing up, her eyes scanning the shadows as if she sensed something watching her. As if she could see beyond the veil. I moved closer, staying hidden in the deepening twilight. As I drew near, I could see what she was drawing, not the park as it appeared to most humans, but something else entirely. Her sketch showed the threshold as I saw it, a place where the shadows gathered and deepened, where reality seemed to flex and bend. She could see it. She was one of those with the sensitivity, the awareness. The hunger stirred, more insistent now. She was a candidate, a potential successor. I could mark her, begin the process of transformation that would eventually make her a guardian like myself. I crept closer, still hidden by the gathering darkness. She continued to sketch, but her movements were becoming more agitated. She kept looking up, scanning the shadows, her brow furrowed in concentration or concern. And then she spoke, her voice soft but clear in the quiet evening air. "I know you're there," she said. "I've seen you before. In my dreams." I froze, shocked by her words. Had she truly seen me? Or was this just the sensitivity that marked her as a potential guardian, allowing her to sense my presence without truly seeing me? "I'm not afraid," she continued, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I've always known there was more to the world than what most people see. More to the shadows." She set down her sketchbook and stood, facing the spot where I was hidden. "Show yourself," she said. "Please." The hunger surged, almost overwhelming in its intensity. She was perfect, not just sensitive to the world beyond the veil, but aware of it, accepting of it. She would make an ideal guardian. But as I prepared to step out of the shadows, to reveal myself to her, I hesitated. I remembered my own fear, my own resistance to the transformation. The pain, the confusion, the loss of my humanity. Did I have the right to inflict that on another? Even for the greater good, even to maintain the balance? I remained hidden, watching her. She waited a moment longer, then sighed and gathered her things. As she turned to leave, she paused and spoke again. "I'll be back tomorrow. Same time." if you want to talk. And then she was gone, walking away down the path, her figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. I stayed where I was, torn between hunger and conscience, between duty and compassion. The cat had said I would know when I found the right one, and every instinct told me this woman was it. But knowing and doing were two different things. As I slipped away into the night to continue my patrol, I made no decision. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the woman would return. And then I would choose. To mark her, to begin her transformation into a guardian like myself. Or to find another way, a different path, to maintain the balance without inflicting the curse of the black cat on another innocent soul. The hunger would not wait forever. The threshold needed its guardians. The balance had to be maintained. But for tonight, at least, I was still human enough to hesitate, to question, to seek a better way. And perhaps, just perhaps, that humanity was worth preserving, even as I prowled the shadows as the black cat in the dark park. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.